The door exploded inward just after midnight. 3 men filled the doorway of the slave cabin, their boots heavy against the rough planks. The overseer held a lantern that swung like a hangman's rope, throwing wild shadows across the walls. Behind him stood 2 hired men from town, strangers with hard faces and whiskey on their breath. Murder lived in their eyes. Dinah stood in the center of her cabin, barefoot on the cold wood floor. She wore only her thin cotton shift, the fabric doing nothing against the November chill that rushed in through the broken door. 22 years old, with skin the color of Tupelo honey and eyes dark as river stones. They called her the most beautiful girl on the Ashford plantation in Louisa County, Virginia. Beauty had never been a blessing. Not for girls like her. She didn't scream, didn't run. There was nowhere to go. So she stood there, arms at her sides, and watched them tear through the only space in this world she'd been allowed to call her own. The overseer, a thick-necked man named Virgil Crenshaw, moved first. He yanked open her trunk, throwing her 2 spare dresses onto the floor. The hired men pulled at the walls, checking for loose boards. One of them grabbed her Bible from the small table beside her bed, flipping through the pages like he expected money to fall out. "Where is it?" Crenshaw growled, not looking at her. Dinah said nothing. In Virginia in 1850, silence was the only safe answer a slave girl could give to a white man's question. They were looking for proof. Proof of what, exactly, she couldn't say. But proof didn't matter as much as suspicion, and suspicion was a noose that tightened with every accusation. Someone had whispered something to someone who whispered it to Master Ashford, and now these men stood in her cabin past midnight, searching for evidence of crimes she may or may not have committed. Crenshaw kicked at her bed frame in frustration. The whole structure shuddered. A support beam cracked. Then he stopped. His boot had struck something that sounded wrong, hollow somehow, like the floorboards beneath weren't quite flush. He dropped to his knees, lantern held low, and peered into the darkness under her bed. His breath caught. The 2 hired men moved closer, curious now. Dinah's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained still as stone. She'd learned years ago how to hide everything that mattered beneath a mask of emptiness. Crenshaw's hand disappeared into the shadows. When it emerged, his fingers trembled. He pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine that had been knotted and unknotted 100 times. The package was thick, heavier than it looked. His face drained of all color. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. The hired men leaned in. One of them reached for the bundle, but Crenshaw jerked it away, holding it against his chest like it might explode. He looked up at Dinah with an expression she'd never seen on a white man's face before. Fear. Not fear of her. Fear of what she'd done. Fear of what he now held in his hands. Because what they found buried beneath that bed would do more than expose Charles Ashford, master of the plantation. It would tear open secrets the entire county had spent decades trying to bury. It would prove that even in bondage, even in silence, even when the world declared you were nothing, you could bear witness to your own life. And that witness could destroy everything. What was hidden beneath Dinah's bed that terrified a man who'd spent 20 years overseeing slaves? Stay with us, because this story is about to reveal a truth so dangerous, it nearly erased itself from history. To understand what Dinah had risked hiding beneath that bed, you need to understand who she was. Not just her name or her age, but what she represented in the brutal economy of 1850s Virginia. She was 22 years old that November night. The enslaved people on the Ashford plantation whispered about her the way people whisper about storms forming on the horizon, with a mixture of awe and dread. She was called the most beautiful girl in Louisa County, maybe in all of central Virginia. Her features held a delicate symmetry that stopped conversations mid-sentence when she entered a room. But in her world, beauty wasn't a gift from God. It was a price tag written in someone else's hand. The economics were simple and vicious. At slave auctions throughout the South, a strong field hand might sell for $800. A skilled blacksmith could fetch $1,200. But a young woman who looked like Dinah? Men would bid $2,000 without blinking. Some would go higher. Masters didn't buy girls like her to pick cotton. That's why she had her own cabin, separate from the quarters where the other enslaved people lived. It sat just 30 yards from the main house, close enough that Charles Ashford could reach it in less than a minute's walk. They called it a privilege. The overseer told the others she was lucky, chosen for special treatment because of her value. The truth was simpler. The cabin wasn't a privilege. It was a cage with better walls. Her days followed the same pattern, week after week, month after month. She woke before dawn and walked to the main house through morning fog that clung to the grass like guilt. Inside, she dusted furniture imported from England, polished silver that cost more than most enslaved families, swept floors made of wood so fine it gleamed like dark water. Eleanor Ashford watched her constantly. The master's wife was a frail woman, wasting away from tuberculosis, spending most hours in her bedroom coughing into lace handkerchiefs. But her eyes followed Dinah through every room. Those eyes knew everything. They saw everything, and they chose to say nothing. Dinah ate her meals alone. Not with the Ashfords, she wasn't family. Not with the other enslaved people, she wasn't quite one of them anymore either. She existed in a space between worlds, belonging nowhere, trusted by no one. The other enslaved people had complicated feelings about her. Some of the older women looked at her with deep sadness, remembering their own younger days, understanding exactly what her separate cabin meant. They would leave extra cornbread outside her door sometimes, wrapped in cloth, a small gesture of solidarity that said, "We see you. We know." But others resented her. They saw the cabin, the lighter work, the fact that her hands weren't torn up from field work. They didn't see, or chose not to see, the price she paid for those things. The nights when heavy footsteps approached her door. The mornings when she walked to the main house moving carefully, like someone whose body hurt in places that didn't show. Jealousy and pity walked hand in hand through the quarters when people spoke her name. Dinah understood their feelings. She didn't blame them. How could she? In a world designed to strip away every shred of humanity, people clung to whatever small hierarchies they could find. If resenting her made their own suffering easier to bear, she could carry that weight too. She'd learned to carry so much already. What none of them knew, what nobody knew until that November night when the overseer's boot struck her bed frame, was that Dinah had been carrying something else. Something far more dangerous than resentment or pity or even pain. She'd been carrying the truth. And in 1850 Virginia, truth was the most dangerous contraband of all. Dinah came into this world the way too many enslaved children did, through blood and loss. It happened on a plantation 40 miles south, near the James River, where the tobacco fields stretched so far they looked like they could swallow the sky. Her mother's name was Patience, though life had given her little reason to live up to it. She was 19 years old, laboring through a difficult birth in a cabin with dirt floors and gaps in the walls wide enough to see moonlight through. The midwife did what she could. But when the hemorrhaging started, there was no doctor coming. Not for a slave woman. Not at 2 in the morning. Not ever. Patience held her daughter once. Just once. Long enough to feel the baby's warmth against her chest, to hear that first cry pierce the darkness. Then the bleeding took her, slow and unstoppable as a river rising. Dinah's first breath was her mother's last. The plantation owner, Thaddeus Caldwell, came to the cabin the next morning. He looked at the infant bundled in rough cloth, at the delicate features already visible even on a newborn face, and his mind went straight to numbers. He saw profit wrapped in brown skin. Investment with 18 years until maturity. "Raise her up gentle," he told the older women in the quarters. "No field work for this one. Keep her hands soft." They understood what he meant. Everybody did. By the time Dinah turned 12, men at the county auctions would stop mid-conversation when she passed. She didn't understand why at first. She was just a child, helping carry water or holding the reins of horses while buyers inspected other enslaved people on the auction block. But she felt their eyes following her, weighing her, calculating something she was too young to name. Caldwell saw it too. He started keeping records, writing down comments he overheard. "That girl gonna be worth something," one planter said. "Pretty as a painting," said another. At 15, Caldwell did the math. 3 strong field hands would sell for maybe $2,400 total. This one girl? She could bring more than that alone. Maybe 3,000. Maybe more if he waited another year, let her fill out a bit more. He waited. At 16, Dinah was sold to Charles Ashford of Louisa County for $3,200, the highest price ever paid for an enslaved person at the Richmond auction house that year. Ashford had a reputation. He collected things. Thoroughbred horses with bloodlines traced back to English racing stock. Furniture shipped from Paris and London. Books bound in leather with gold lettering on the spines. And enslaved people who looked like they belonged in museums instead of tobacco fields. His wife Eleanor was everything her husband was not. Where Charles was robust and commanding, Eleanor was thin as paper, her body slowly consumed by tuberculosis. She spent most days in her bedroom, curtains drawn against the light, coughing into handkerchiefs she kept hidden in her sleeves. She knew what her husband did, where he went at night, who he visited. She knew everything and said nothing. Willful blindness was the only power she had left. When Dinah arrived at the Ashford estate, she was taken to a cabin that sat separate from the others, close to the main house, close enough to be summoned at any hour. The older enslaved women who helped her settle in didn't need to explain. Their faces said everything. One of them, a woman named Hattie who worked in the kitchen, touched Dinah's cheek gently before leaving. "I'm sorry, child," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Dinah didn't cry. She'd learned young that tears changed nothing. Her mother had died bringing her into a world that saw her as merchandise before she'd taken her first breath. Her childhood had been stolen by men who looked at her and saw dollar signs. Now, at 16, whatever remained of her innocence would be taken too. This was the price of being seen. The first time Charles Ashford came to her cabin, Dinah was 17 years old. It was a Thursday evening in March, just after the supper bell had rung across the plantation. She heard his footsteps on the path outside, confident, unhurried, the walk of a man who owned everything he could see and most of what he couldn't. He didn't knock. Men like him never did. He carried a bottle of French wine in one hand and a silver comb in the other. The comb caught the lamplight, delicate scrollwork etched into the handle. Beautiful. Expensive. Meaningless. "Brought you something nice," he said, setting both items on her small table. His voice was casual, like he was discussing the weather. Like this was normal. Like she had a choice. Dinah stood near the fireplace, her hands clasped in front of her. She'd learned the posture from the older women, eyes down, face neutral, body still. Make yourself small. Make yourself quiet. Maybe he'll leave faster. He didn't leave. What happened next isn't something that needs detailed description. You can fill in the blanks yourself. The wine stayed unopened. The comb stayed on the table. And Dinah learned the brutal calculus that would govern the rest of her time on the Ashford plantation. Resistance brought the whip. She saw it happen to another girl who said no. 20 lashes that left her back looking like torn fabric. Compliance brought gifts she couldn't wear in daylight, jewelry that had to stay hidden in her trunk because the other enslaved people would know exactly what it meant. There was no third option. No escape route. No appeal to a higher authority because Charles Ashford was the highest authority for miles in every direction. So Dinah learned to survive by becoming something less than human. Something mechanical. She woke each morning before dawn and walked to the main house through whatever weather came, rain, fog, summer heat, winter cold. Inside, she moved like a wind-up doll, performing tasks with perfect precision and zero thought. Dust the furniture. Polish the silver. Sweep the floors. Wash the windows. Her hands moved, her feet carried her from room to room, but her mind retreated somewhere deep inside where his hands couldn't reach. She became a ghost haunting her own life. Eleanor Ashford watched it all happen. The mistress of the house spent hours in her rocking chair by the parlor window, a blanket across her lap even in summer, coughing into handkerchiefs that came away spotted with blood. Her eyes followed Dinah through every room, hollow eyes that knew exactly what her husband did after dark. But Eleanor never spoke. Not one word of acknowledgement or sympathy or even accusation. Her silence was its own kind of violence, a choice to preserve her own comfort at the cost of another woman's suffering. Sometimes Dinah wondered which was worse, the men who committed the crimes or the women who witnessed them and looked away. The other enslaved people whispered. Always whispers, never direct conversation. Some of the older women understood. They'd lived the same story themselves, years or decades earlier. They left food outside Dinah's cabin sometimes, extra biscuits, a piece of salt pork, once a small jar of honey. Gifts that said, "We know. We're sorry. We can't help, but we see you." Others were less kind. Dinah heard their voices through the thin cabin walls at night, bitter words about privilege and special treatment. She got her own place. Don't work the fields. Eats better than us. They saw the surface and judged it, never looking deeper at what those privileges actually cost. She couldn't blame them. In a world designed to strip away dignity, people clung to whatever comparisons made their own pain bearable. If hating her made their day easier, she could carry that burden too. She was already carrying so much else. The months blurred together. Spring became summer, became fall, became winter, became spring again. Time moved, but Dinah felt frozen in place, trapped in a routine that ground her down like water wearing away stone. Each day she died a little more. Each night she learned to disappear a little deeper inside herself. The psychological toll was harder to bear than any physical wound. Scars on skin eventually healed. But what was happening to her spirit? That damage went deeper than flesh, deeper than bone, into places that might never recover. By her 18th birthday, Dinah barely recognized herself in the mirror. The girl who'd arrived from Richmond 2 years earlier was gone. In her place stood someone hollowed out, someone who'd learned to survive by becoming empty. This was what silence cost. This slow death of everything that made a person human. Then, on a cold evening in January of 1849, everything changed. Word spread through the quarters in whispers, the kind of whispers that carried hope instead of gossip. A traveling preacher had arrived in Louisa County. Not the usual type who came to tell enslaved people that suffering was God's will and obedience was holy duty. This one was different. His name was Reverend Silas Holt, a thin white man from Pennsylvania with wire-rimmed spectacles and a belief so dangerous it could get him killed. He thought all souls were equal before God. Not separate, but equal. Not equal in the next life if you behaved in this one. Equal now. Equal always. Equal in ways that made Virginia law look like blasphemy. He held meetings in the woods after dark, teaching enslaved people to read using the Bible. In Virginia in 1849, teaching a slave to read was illegal. Not just frowned upon, illegal. Punishable by mutilation if you were black, imprisonment if you were white, and death if the authorities decided to make an example. The law was clear. Literacy was power, and power in the hands of enslaved people was too dangerous to permit. But Reverend Holt came anyway. Dinah heard about the meetings from Hattie, the kitchen woman who sometimes left food outside her cabin. "There's a man in the woods past the old tobacco barn," Hattie whispered one morning while they were both drawing water from the well. "Tuesday and Thursday nights. Come if you want. Don't come if you scared. Either way, don't tell nobody who might talk." Dinah went that Thursday. She wrapped herself in a threadbare shawl and slipped out of her cabin after the main house went dark. The walk through the woods felt like walking through a dream, or maybe waking up from one. 20 or so enslaved people sat in a small clearing, hidden by pine trees and darkness. The Reverend stood in the center, holding a lantern. He didn't preach. He taught. Using a stick, he traced letters in the dirt. Large, clear strokes that looked like magic being pulled from nothing. "This is A," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is B. This is C. The alphabet." 26 symbols that, combined correctly, could capture any thought, any idea, any truth that had ever existed or ever would. Dinah stared at those letters like they were doorways opening in a wall she'd thought was solid. It felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. She came back the next week, and the week after that, through February's bitter cold and March's mud and April's rain. She sat in the back, away from the lantern light, and absorbed everything. The Reverend moved slowly, patiently, understanding that most of the people gathered had spent their entire lives being told they were too stupid to learn anything beyond orders. He proved them wrong. Within months, Dinah could read simple passages from the Bible. She'd trace the words with her finger, sounding them out silently, feeling her mind expand with each sentence she understood. Within a year, she could write, clumsy at first, her letters uneven and her spelling uncertain, but readable. And with that skill came a question that burned through her brain like fire through dry grass. What if she wrote it down? All of it. Every visit to her cabin. Every crime committed in darkness and denied in daylight. Every child born with features that matched the master's face but were called lies. Every woman sold away when her presence became inconvenient. Every act of violence dressed up as discipline. What if she documented everything? The idea terrified her. Writing meant evidence. Evidence meant danger. If anyone found out she could write, they'd punish her. If they found what she'd written, they'd kill her. But something stronger than fear was growing inside her now. Something that had been buried so deep she'd forgotten it existed. Agency. The power to act. The refusal to be nothing but a victim. Literacy gave her that. For the first time since Charles Ashford had walked through her cabin door without knocking, Dinah had something that belonged only to her. A skill he didn't know about. A weapon he couldn't see. And she was going to use it. Not to fight back directly, that would be suicide. But to bear witness. To create a record that couldn't be silenced or denied or erased. To prove that even in bondage, even when the world declared you were property instead of human, you could still claim your own story. You could still tell the truth. And truth, she was beginning to understand, was the most powerful weapon of all. Dinah started small. She had to. Paper wasn't something enslaved people could just ask for. But she learned to be resourceful in ways that would have impressed her if she'd had the luxury of being impressed with herself. She collected scraps, torn pages from ledgers that the overseer threw away when he made mistakes. The backs of bills and receipts that got tossed in the trash behind the main house. Once, she found 3 blank pages that had been ripped from a book, probably by one of the Ashford children who'd gotten bored with their lessons. She took them all, smoothed them flat, hid them in her cabin. The Bible came from Eleanor Ashford herself, given to Dinah on Christmas Day in 1848. It was a small leather-bound edition, worn at the edges but still readable. Eleanor had pressed it into Dinah's hands with the kind of patronizing charity that wealthy white women specialized in. "Read this and find comfort," Eleanor had said, her voice thin with illness and ignorance. What Eleanor didn't know, what she couldn't imagine, was that Dinah could actually read it. and that the blank pages in the back would become something far more dangerous than scripture. She wrote at night. By the light of tallow candles, she stole one at a time from the main house. Stealing them was risky, but what she was writing was riskier still. She worked slowly, carefully, her handwriting shaky at first like a child learning penmanship. But it grew stronger with practice. Her first entry was dated January 14, 1848. She remembered the date because it was 2 days after her 18th birthday, not that anyone had celebrated. Master came after supper. Brought whiskey. Left bruises shaped like fingerprints on my arms. I counted them. 10 total. 5 on each arm where he held me down. Writing those words felt like pulling poison from a wound. It hurt. But it also helped. She kept going. March 2nd, 1848. Becca's baby born in the quarters this morning. Light skin. Green eyes like Master Ashford. Master came to look at the baby and walked away without saying nothing. Told the overseer to write in the records that Becca been with field hands. Everyone knows the truth. Nobody says it. Becca worked in the kitchen. She was 19 years old, round-faced and quiet, the kind of quiet that came from swallowing screams. Her baby had features that couldn't be denied. Light skin that stood out among the darker-skinned children in the quarters, eyes that were unmistakably Ashford green. But Charles Ashford claimed no responsibility, just like he'd done with other children over the years. The official record would say the father was unknown, maybe one of the field hands. Anything to avoid the truth. Dinah documented it all. July 19, 1849. Master sold Becca's baby south today. Trader came from Georgia. Paid $400 for a 1-year-old child. Becca tried to run after the wagon. Made it maybe 100 yards before they caught her. Brought her back with dogs. Overseer gave her 20 lashes in front of everyone. I heard her screaming from my cabin. It went on so long I thought she might die. She didn't die. Sometimes I think that's worse. That entry took Dinah 3 nights to finish because she had to keep stopping. Her hands would shake so badly she couldn't control the quill. The memory of those screams lived in her bones now, permanent as scars. But she finished it. Because this was the point. This was why she risked everything to write these words down. Someone needed to remember. Someone needed to witness. Someone needed to create a record that couldn't be denied or rewritten or explained away. She wrapped the pages in oilcloth she'd taken from the storage shed, the kind used to protect tools from rust. Then she pried up a loose floorboard beneath her bed and tucked the bundle into the dark space underneath. It fit perfectly, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. This became her ritual. Every few nights, she'd add another entry. Another date. Another crime. Another name. The bundle grew thicker. 5 pages. 10 pages. 20. It was dangerous. It was reckless. If anyone found out she could write, they'd sell her south to the sugar plantations in Louisiana where enslaved people worked until they died, usually within 7 years. If they found what she'd written, they'd kill her outright. But it was also the only thing that made her feel human. Because if she could name it, write it, preserve it, then it was real. And if it was real, then she was real. Not property. Not an object. A person. A witness to her own life and the lives destroyed around her. That mattered. Maybe it was all that mattered. The months stretched into years. 1849 became 1850. The seasons turned, but Dinah's ritual never stopped. Her chronicle grew beyond just her own suffering. She documented everything she witnessed, everything she heard whispered in the main house while she dusted furniture, everything the other enslaved women told her in hurried conversations when no white people were watching. She wrote about Naomi, who'd worked in the Ashford household for 12 years. Naomi had given birth to 3 children, all light-skinned, all sold away before they turned 5. Dinah recorded the dates of each birth, each sale, each time Naomi's screams echoed through the quarters. She wrote about Ruth, who got pregnant at 15. When she miscarried after the overseer beat her for dropping a water bucket, Charles Ashford docked her food rations as punishment for losing valuable property. She wrote about Abigail and Miriam and Clara and all the others whose names deserved to be remembered. Women whose stories would have vanished completely if Dinah hadn't been there with her stolen paper and candlelight, preserving what the world wanted erased. The children especially haunted her entries. Boys and girls born with features that screamed their parentage. Green eyes in a sea of brown, lighter skin that couldn't be explained away. The shape of Charles Ashford's jaw appearing on infant faces. All of them denied. All of them declared illegitimate. All of them sold south before they could grow old enough to ask questions. The psychological toll was immense. Some nights, Dinah's hands cramped so badly from gripping the quill that she had to stop writing and flex her fingers until the pain eased. Her eyes strained from working by weak candlelight, giving her headaches that lasted for days. But worse than the physical pain was the emotional weight of bearing witness. Every entry she wrote meant reliving someone's trauma. Every name she recorded belonged to a person whose suffering she couldn't stop, couldn't prevent, could only document. She carried all of it. Every story, every scream, every child torn from their mother's arms. The danger multiplied with every page she added. Her bundle beneath the floorboard grew thicker, harder to hide. 30 pages. 40. 50. Each one was potential evidence that could get her killed. She knew what happened to enslaved people who learned to read and write. She knew what happened to those who kept records, who documented crimes, who threatened the carefully constructed lies that kept the system running. Death, if she was lucky. Sail to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, if she wasn't. A slower death under a sun that cooked the life out of people in 7 years or less. Yet she continued. The compulsion was stronger than fear now. Something had shifted inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back in the only way available to her. Her weapon wasn't violence. That would have gotten her killed in minutes. Her weapon was memory, truth. The refusal to let these crimes disappear into the silence that covered everything like fog over the James River. By November 1850, her testament contained 73 pages. 73 pages of dates and names and details that would destroy Charles Ashford if they ever saw daylight. 73 pages that proved enslaved women weren't property, they were people. Witnesses to their own lives. Historians of their own suffering. The stakes couldn't be higher. If the pages were discovered, everyone involved would face consequences. Ashford would be ruined. The overseer would be implicated. The whole rotten structure might crack open. And Dinah? She'd be dead within a day. But that's the thing about truth. Once you start telling it, you can't stop. The higher the stakes climbed, the more urgently she needed to document everything. Because if she died tomorrow, at least the record would exist. Hidden, yes. Buried beneath floorboards, yes. But real. Undeniable. Permanent. And worth dying for. While Dinah documented crimes in secret, Eleanor Ashford was dying in plain sight. By the fall of 1850, the mistress of the house weighed less than 90 pounds. Her dresses hung off her frame like curtains on skeletal windows. She spent most days in her bedroom, propped up on pillows, curtains drawn against the light that hurt her eyes. Tuberculosis was eating her alive from the inside out, one bloody cough at a time. But here's what nobody expected. As her body wasted away, her mind grew sharper. Rage has a way of focusing the mind. And Eleanor had years of rage stored up, compressed into her failing lungs like powder waiting for a spark. She'd always known about Dinah. From the very first week the girl arrived from Richmond, Eleanor understood exactly why Charles had paid $3,000. She wasn't stupid. She wasn't blind. She was just powerless, which in many ways was worse than either. Knowledge without power is its own special kind of torment. You see everything, understand everything, and can do nothing to change it. So you swallow it. Day after day. Year after year. Until the weight of what you know becomes heavier than your own body. That November, something changed. Eleanor was in her bedroom, half asleep, when she heard her husband's voice drifting up from his study. He was talking to Virgil Crenshaw, the overseer. Their voices carried through the heating vents, a design flaw in the house that had given Eleanor access to countless conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. "We need to be careful," Charles was saying. "There are rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Crenshaw asked. "Someone on the plantation is documenting things. Keeping records. Maybe teaching people to read." The Caldwell plantation had similar problems last year. Turned out to be an abolitionist sympathizer from up north working as a field hand. Eleanor's eyes opened. "You think we got abolitionists here?" Crenshaw sounded doubtful. "I don't know what we have. But if there's evidence, written evidence, of anything inappropriate, we need to find it before it becomes a problem. Search the quarters. Quietly. Check the field hands first." Eleanor sat up in bed, her mind racing despite her body's exhaustion. Charles suspected the field hands. Of course he did. He'd never imagined someone close to the house might be literate, might be documenting, might be building a case against him in careful handwriting. But Eleanor knew better. She'd watched Dinah for over 4 years now. Watched the way the girl's eyes moved across pages when she dusted the study. Watched her handle books with a familiarity that went beyond cleaning them. Watched her fingers trace over the spines of volumes in the library, lingering just a second too long. Eleanor had suspected for at least a year that Dinah could read. And if she could read, she could write. The tuberculosis sent her into a coughing fit that lasted 5 minutes. When she finally stopped, her handkerchief was soaked with blood. More blood than usual, which meant she had weeks left at most. Maybe days. A woman drowning doesn't have the luxury of careful planning. She just acts. Eleanor was drowning. Had been drowning for years in a marriage that suffocated her, in a house full of crimes she witnessed but couldn't stop, in a body that was slowly betraying her. She'd spent her entire adult life being complicit in her husband's sins through her silence. But she could still make one choice. One final act before the water closed over her head completely. She rang the bell beside her bed. A house servant appeared within minutes. "Fetch Mr. Crenshaw," Eleanor said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Tell him to come alone. Tell him I have information about who's been keeping records." The servant left. Eleanor lay back against her pillows and stared at the ceiling. Was this revenge? Jealousy? Justice? Maybe all three. Maybe none. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. She was dying, and the girl who'd taken her husband's attention for 4 years had been hiding something all along. Something dangerous enough to destroy Charles. If Eleanor couldn't save herself, at least she could watch everything burn. She sent them to Dinah's cabin that night. Not out of righteousness. Not out of concern for the law. Out of pure, concentrated rage at a world that had ground her into dust while pretending she was a lady. Eleanor Ashford was both victim and perpetrator. Trapped and trapping. Suffering and inflicting suffering. That's the moral complexity of systems like slavery. They corrupt everyone they touch, turning even the powerless into instruments of cruelty. Which brings us back to that midnight raid, the moment when everything Dinah had built came crashing down. Virgil Crenshaw arrived at her cabin just after midnight with 2 men from town. She recognized one of them, a tobacco trader named Willis who sometimes did business with Charles Ashford. The other was a stranger with a scar across his cheek and hands that looked like they'd broken things before. They had their instructions from Eleanor: find proof of literacy, proof of rebellion, proof of anything that could justify selling this girl south to Louisiana, where problems disappeared into cane fields and never came back. The door exploded inward. No warning. No announcement. Just 3 men with lantern light and whiskey courage filling her small space. Dinah stood in the center of her cabin, barefoot in her cotton shift, and watched them destroy the only place she'd been allowed to exist. She didn't run. Didn't fight. Didn't scream. There was no point. Whatever was about to happen had been inevitable from the moment she'd picked up that first stolen quill. Crenshaw went straight for her trunk, throwing her spare dresses onto the floor. Willis checked the walls, running his hands along the boards looking for hidden compartments. The scarred man grabbed her Bible from the bedside table and flipped through it roughly, like he expected stolen money to fall out. "Where is it?" Crenshaw demanded. Dinah said nothing. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, but her face remained perfectly still. Years of survival had taught her how to hide everything that mattered behind a mask of emptiness. They tore through everything. Her bedding got ripped off and thrown aside. Her small table was overturned. They checked inside her water pitcher, behind the loose stones in the fireplace, under the few pieces of clothing she owned. Then Crenshaw kicked her bed frame in frustration. The whole structure shuddered. A support beam cracked. And something about the sound, hollow, wrong, made him stop. He dropped to his knees, holding the lantern low, and peered into the darkness beneath her bed. His breath caught. His hand reached into the shadows and found the loose floorboard. It came up easily, too easily, like it had been pried up and replaced hundreds of times. Beneath it lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. His hands trembled as he pulled it out. The package was heavier than it looked, weighted with the kind of density that only pages and pages of writing could create. He set it on the floor and began unwrapping the twine, his movements suddenly careful, like he was handling something that might explode. The oilcloth fell away. 73 pages spilled out across the rough wooden floor. Willis and the scarred man moved closer, their shadows falling across the scattered papers. Even in the weak lantern light, the writing was clear. Dates. Names. Details written in cramped but readable script that covered both sides of every page. Crenshaw picked up the first page. His eyes moved across the words. His face went pale. Then gray. Then something close to green. January 14th, 1848. Master came after supper. Brought whiskey. Left bruises shaped like fingerprints. He dropped that page and grabbed another. March 2nd, 1848. Becca's baby born. Light skin. Green eyes. Master won't claim him. Another page. July 19th, 1849. Master sold Becca's baby south. Trader came from Georgia. She tried to run. They brought her back with dogs. 20 lashes. Crenshaw read faster now, his hands shaking harder with each page. Dates going back 15 years. Names of women he knew, women who'd worked on this plantation long before Dinah arrived. Children born and sold. Beatings documented with clinical precision. Rapes recorded in careful handwriting that somehow made them more real than if they'd been screamed. This wasn't just evidence. This was a meticulous record of Charles Ashford's crimes stretching back a decade and a half. Written testimony in the careful script of a girl who'd been declared property under Virginia law, but had proven herself to be something far more dangerous. A witness. A historian. A person. The overseer looked up at Dinah, who still stood in the center of her violated cabin, her face unreadable. "How'd you learn to write?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dinah didn't answer. What could she say? That a traveling preacher had taught her in secret meetings in the woods? that she'd practiced by candlelight for 2 years until her handwriting was strong enough to document the truth? That every word on those pages was real, verifiable, undeniable? No answer would save her now. They both knew it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that couldn't be said, everything that was about to happen, everything that would never be the same again. Crenshaw looked back down at the pages scattered across the floor. Evidence that could destroy his employer. Evidence that implicated him too, since he was mentioned by name in at least a dozen entries. "Lord have mercy," he whispered again. But there would be no mercy. Not for Dinah. Not for any of them. The truth was out. They dragged Dinah to the main house before dawn. Not violently. Crenshaw wasn't cruel by nature, just complicit, but firmly enough that she knew resistance would only make things worse. The sky was still dark when they walked up the steps to the front entrance. Dinah had never been allowed through the front door before. Enslaved people used the back entrance, the servants' stairs, the hidden pathways that kept them invisible to guests. Walking through the main door felt like crossing into forbidden territory, which she supposed it was. Charles Ashford was in his study, slumped in his leather chair with an empty whiskey bottle on the floor beside him. He'd been drinking since supper the night before, and it showed. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his hair uncombed, his eyes red and unfocused. Crenshaw laid the 73 pages on the mahogany desk. They made a sound like judgment falling. "You need to see this, sir," the overseer said quietly. Ashford looked at the papers with confusion at first, then growing alarm. He sat up straighter, reached for the top page, and began to read. Dinah watched his face cycle through emotions like weather changing. Disbelief first, his eyebrows raised, mouth opening slightly. Then fury, his jaw clenched, nostrils flared, face flushing red. Then terror, the color draining away completely as he realized what he was holding. His hands started shaking. He picked up another page. Then another. Reading faster now, his eyes darting across the careful handwriting that documented his crimes with dates he remembered, names he recognized, details he'd thought were buried in darkness and silence. November 3rd, 1847. Master visited quarters after midnight. Naomi's cabin. Her husband Isaac assigned to tobacco barn overnight. Convenient timing. He remembered that night. How could he forget? He'd ordered Isaac to work late specifically so he could. Ashford dropped the page like it burned him. Where did this come from? His voice was rough, scraped raw by whiskey and fear. Crenshaw gestured toward Dinah, who stood near the doorway with her arms at her sides. "She wrote it, sir. All of it. Been hiding it under her bed for years." Ashford stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "She can't write. She's—" He stopped himself before saying the word, but they all heard it anyway. Property. That's what he meant. Property couldn't write. Property couldn't bear witness. Property couldn't threaten everything he'd built. But Dinah could, and had. "Burn it," Ashford ordered, his voice rising. "Burn all of it. Right now. In the fireplace." Crenshaw hesitated. For the first time in 20 years of working for Charles Ashford, the overseer didn't immediately obey. "Sir," he said carefully, "I've read these pages. If even one of them reaches the wrong person, a northern journalist, an abolitionist lawyer, a judge with connections up north, you're finished. We're all finished. That's why we burn them." But she knows what she wrote. She could tell people. She could. Then we sell her south. Tonight. Get a trader here by tomorrow morning. Louisiana. The sugar plantations. Let her try to talk down there where nobody listens to slaves and people work until they die. The room fell silent except for Ashford's ragged breathing. Then they heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, shuffling footsteps that sounded like death walking. Eleanor Ashford appeared in the study doorway. She looked like a ghost already. Her nightgown hung off her skeletal frame like a burial shroud. Her face was gray, her lips almost blue. She leaned against the doorframe for support, her breathing labored and wet. But her eyes were clear, clearer than they'd been in years. She looked at the pages scattered across her husband's desk, then at Dinah, standing straight-backed and silent near the door, then at Charles, caught like a rat in a trap of his own making. Eleanor's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles could hold that much bitterness. "You deserve each other," she whispered. Then she turned and walked back upstairs, each step an act of will. They heard her bedroom door close. After that, silence. 3 days later, Eleanor Ashford was found dead in her bed. The doctor who examined her body declared it tuberculosis, a disease that had been killing her for years finally completing its work. He signed the death certificate without question. Natural causes. Expected outcome. Nothing suspicious. But the enslaved people in the quarters whispered different theories. They said Eleanor had simply surrendered, that she'd held on long enough to watch her husband's world start to crumble, and then let go. They called it her final act. The last choice available to a woman who'd spent her entire marriage powerless. Maybe they were right. Maybe the doctor was. Maybe both. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that Eleanor Ashford had set events in motion that couldn't be stopped. She'd sent men to Dinah's cabin knowing exactly what they'd find. She'd exposed the truth not out of justice, but out of rage at a world that had ground her into dust. And now everyone complicit in Charles Ashford's crimes, including Eleanor herself, through her years of willful blindness, faced their reckoning. Some reckonings come with justice. Others just come with consequences. This one came with both. 2 weeks after Eleanor's funeral, Charles Ashford finally made his decision about Dinah. Those 2 weeks had been strange. Dinah stayed in her cabin, guarded but not chained. She received her meals, cornbread, dried beans, water, but no one spoke to her. The other enslaved people avoided her completely now, like she carried a contagious disease. Maybe she did. The disease of literacy. The disease of bearing witness. The disease of refusing to disappear quietly. Ashford spent those weeks drinking and pacing his study, the 73 pages locked in his desk drawer where he could see them but no one else could. He'd read them all by now, multiple times, each reading making him sicker than the last. The threat was simple: sell her south to the Louisiana sugar plantations. Send her somewhere so brutal that life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. Somewhere so far from Virginia that whatever she said, whatever she claimed, would never reach ears that mattered. Somewhere she'd disappear completely, swallowed by heat and labor and death. That was the obvious solution. The safe solution. But Virgil Crenshaw proposed something different. "There's a Quaker family in Pennsylvania," the overseer said one evening, standing in Ashford's study with his hat in his hands. "They've got connections to the Underground Railroad. They buy enslaved people sometimes, pay market price, then free them legally. It's all above board, documented proper." Ashford looked at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "Why would I sell her to abolitionists?" "Because they're quiet, sir. They don't ask questions. They don't publicize the transactions. And once she's their problem, not yours. She disappears just as completely, but without the blood on your hands if something goes wrong with a southern sale." Crenshaw didn't say what they were both thinking: if Dinah died on the way to Louisiana, or if she talked to the wrong person before she got there, the scandal could still break. But if she went north, legally purchased by Quakers who minded their own business, the problem was solved before it became public. Ashford stared at his whiskey glass for a long moment, then nodded. "Make the arrangements, but quietly, and burn the papers first. All of them." That night, They built a fire in the study fireplace even though it was late November and the room was already warm. Ashford sat in his leather chair, the bundle of 73 pages in his lap, and fed them to the flames one at a time. Page by page, testimony turned to ash. January 14, 1848, curled black and disappeared up the chimney. March 2, 1848, burned orange and red before crumbling into nothing. July 19, 1849, turned to smoke and scattered into the night air. All the dates, all the names, all the careful documentation of crimes that had been hidden in darkness for 15 years. Gone. Destroyed. Erased as completely as if they'd never existed. Charles Ashford watched with eyes that looked dead even though he was still breathing. He understood what he was destroying. Not just evidence of his crimes, but proof of Dinah's humanity. Proof that enslaved people could think, remember, document, bear witness. Proof that they were people, not property. Burning those pages was another kind of violence. Maybe worse than what he'd done to create them in the first place. 2 days later, a man arrived at the plantation with proper papers and $800. The transaction was conducted in Ashford's study with no witnesses except Crenshaw. Money exchanged hands. Documents were signed. Dinah was sold to the Quaker family in Pennsylvania, legally and officially. She left that same night. The journey north happened in darkness and silence. She was passed from conductor to conductor along the Underground Railroad, safe houses and hidden rooms and wagons with false bottoms. People whose names she never learned guided her through territories she'd never seen. Pennsylvania. Freedom. Words that felt impossible until they became real. It took 3 weeks to reach the Quaker family's home outside Philadelphia. 3 weeks of moving only at night, sleeping during the day, trusting strangers who risked their own safety to help her. When she finally arrived, a woman named Ruth opened the door and said words Dinah had never heard directed at her before. "Welcome home." But even that moment was bittersweet, because Dinah understood what her freedom had cost. The testimony she'd spent years creating was ash. The record she'd built was destroyed. The evidence that could have brought Charles Ashford to justice was scattered in smoke across the Virginia night sky. She was free, but the truth was not. That's the compromise that survival sometimes demands. That's the bargain people make when all their choices are bad ones. Dinah had escaped, but her testimony, the thing that had made her feel human, was erased as completely as if it had never existed. The Quaker family's name was Morrison. They gave Dinah a room on the second floor of their house, a real room with a door that locked from the inside and a window that looked out over a garden where nothing was grown by enslaved hands. They gave her work in their dry goods shop, paying her wages she could keep. They gave her access to their library, shelf after shelf of books she could read without hiding, without fear, without wondering if literacy would get her killed. But most importantly, they gave her paper, and ink, and time. Dinah never stopped writing. The Virginia Testament might have burned, but the memories didn't. The stories didn't. The names and dates and details that she'd spent years documenting still lived in her mind, sharp as broken glass. So she wrote them again. Not as evidence this time, but as testimony. Not hidden beneath floorboards, but published under a pseudonym in books that northern readers consumed like forbidden fruit. Over the next 40 years, Dinah would pen 3 books. The first came out in 1855, 5 years after she arrived in Pennsylvania. She called it The House on the River and claimed it was fiction, a story about an enslaved woman on a Virginia plantation who witnessed crimes she couldn't stop. The characters had different names. The plantation had a different location. But anyone who read carefully could recognize the truth beneath the story. Northern abolitionist newspapers reviewed it favorably. Ministers quoted passages in sermons about the evils of slavery. Anti-slavery societies distributed copies at meetings and rallies. Frederick Douglass himself mentioned it in a speech, calling it a window into horrors that many Americans prefer to ignore. Her second book came in 1861, right as the war started. This one was bolder, angrier, documenting not just individual crimes but the entire system that made them possible. How the law protected masters. How churches blessed bondage. How even well-meaning white people participated in oppression through their silence. It sold more copies than the first. Her third book was published in 1868, 3 years after the war ended. This one was different, quieter, more reflective. It focused on the women who survived, who bore witness, who carried the weight of memory even after freedom came. Critics called it her masterpiece. But through all of it, all 3 books, all the acclaim, all the influence her words had on abolitionist movements, Dinah never used her real name. She published under the pseudonym D. Patience, honoring the mother she'd never known who died bringing her into the world. She never revealed what had been buried beneath her bed in Virginia. Never spoke publicly about the 73 pages that had been burned. Some truths were too dangerous to tell even in freedom. Some stories could still get people killed, even after the laws changed. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, Charles Ashford was dying his own slow death. The war destroyed him financially. Union troops occupied his plantation in 1862, freeing all the enslaved people and burning his tobacco barns. When the Confederacy fell in 1865, so did whatever remained of his wealth and power. He died in 1867, 2 years after Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Bankrupt. Alone. Living in a house that was slowly falling apart around him because he had no money to maintain it, and no enslaved labor to do the work. The plantation was divided and sold to pay his debts. The main house went to a northern businessman who turned it into a hotel. The fields were parceled out to small farmers. And the cabins where enslaved people had lived? Those were torn down completely. They were repurposed for barns and fences and chicken coops. It was an attempt to erase history through physical destruction. If you tore down the buildings, maybe you could pretend the crimes committed inside them had never happened. If you scattered the wood and buried the foundations, maybe the suffering would disappear too. But history doesn't work that way. Dinah's books remained in circulation. Her words continued to influence people who'd never met her, never knew her real name, never understood that she was writing from memory about crimes she'd once documented in secret by candlelight. The justice was incomplete. Charles Ashford never faced trial. The women he'd violated never received apology or compensation. The children he'd fathered and then sold away never learned their true parentage. But the testimony survived. Changed form, yes. Published under a false name, yes. Transformed from evidence into literature, yes. But alive. Remembered. Preserved. And sometimes that's all you can hope for, that the truth outlives the people who tried to destroy it. So what did they really find buried beneath Dinah's bed that November night in 1850? 73 pages of paper, yes. Dates and names and details, yes. Evidence of crimes that could have destroyed a powerful man, yes. But it was more than that. What Dinah buried beneath her bed was testimony. A refusal to let suffering disappear into the silence that covered plantations like morning fog. A declaration that even in bondage, even when the law declared her property instead of human, she was a witness to her own life. And that witness mattered. Still matters. Because here we are, over 170 years later, talking about her. Remembering her name. Understanding what she risked to document truth in a world built on lies. The pages might have burned, but the act of creating them, the courage it took, the nights spent writing by stolen candlelight, the decision to bear witness even when witness meant death, that can never be destroyed. When we uncover stories like Dinah's, we're not just learning history. We're recovering what was stolen. Voices that were silenced. Names that were forgotten. truths that powerful people spent generations trying to bury. But here's the question that should haunt us. How many more Dinahs were there? How many enslaved women learned to read and write in secret? How many documented the crimes committed against them and their communities? How many hid their testimony beneath floorboards, inside walls, under the foundations of cabins that were later torn down and scattered? How many testimonies existed that we'll never know about because they were found and burned? Because the people who wrote them were sold away or killed before they could preserve their words. Because history is written by those in power, and those in power had every reason to erase these stories. We'll never know the full number. But we know Dinah wasn't alone. She couldn't have been. Wherever oppression exists, resistance exists too. Wherever people are told they don't matter, someone fights to prove otherwise. The pages Dinah wrote may be gone, turned to ash in Charles Ashford's fireplace. But the truth they contained can never be fully destroyed. Because once you know that someone tried to document their own suffering, tried to leave proof of what was done to them, you carry that knowledge forward. You become part of the record, part of the testimony, part of the refusal to let these stories disappear. That's the most powerful discovery of all. Not the pages themselves, but what they represent. The unbreakable human need to be seen, to be heard, to matter. The resistance that happens in darkness, with stolen tools, at great personal risk. The courage it takes to say, I was here. This happened. You will not erase me. Dinah lived until 1894, dying at age 66 in the same Pennsylvania house where she'd found freedom 44 years earlier. Her books were still being read. Her words still quoted. Her testimony, transformed but unbroken, still speaking truth to people who needed to hear it. She never got justice in the legal sense. Charles Ashford never faced consequences in his lifetime. The women he violated never received compensation. The system that enabled his crimes continued long after his death. But Dinah won anyway, because she refused to disappear, because she documented, because she bore witness, because she transformed her stolen voice into published words that outlived everyone who tried to silence her. That's the legacy we carry forward. Not just Dinah's story, but every story like hers. Every voice that history tried to silence. Every testimony that powerful people worked to destroy. If you want to honor stories like Dinah's, subscribe to this channel and join us in preserving the voices history tried to erase. Every story we uncover is an act of remembrance. And remembrance is how we ensure that those who suffered are never forgotten. Because the most dangerous thing to those in power isn't violence. It's memory. It's testimony. It's the refusal to let truth die. Dinah knew that. She proved it. And now, so do you.